back to another enlightening episode of The Truth About the Plant, the show that takes you on a journey through the world of psychoactive plants and alternative wellness, all while delivering real, actionable insights you crave. I'm your host, Christina Dees, and this is my equally talented co-host, Dr. Amanda Ryman, and she gets to tell you why we're here.
Well, we are here because if you've ever tried to go on the internet and find a good answer about cannabis, you know just how difficult it is. You have a question, one that may be related to your health or your safety. You go online, you Google it, and you get 100 different answers, many of which contradict each other completely. So how are you supposed to know what the truth is? Well, that's where we come in. We're here to give you 15 minutes or less actionable insights that you can use to make better choices about your own cannabis consumption and how cannabis fits in your life. We are always going to tell you the truth. So think of us as your kick-ass granddaughters or your really cool aunties, the ladies in your life who would never lie to you.
In part 2 of our series on the high, we're asking the question, is there really a difference between intoxication and impairment? So we're going to untangle these terms and see what separates the buzz from the blur. Dr. Ryman, we all know someone who can use copious amounts of cannabis, but never seems to act like they're high. I definitely know some people like that. And some medical cannabis patients use cannabis multiple times throughout the day, and they still go to work, they manage households, they're able to drive a car. The THC in cannabis binds to our receptors no matter how high our tolerance is, yet not all consumers seem impaired by this activity. So is there a difference between intoxication and impairment?
Well, I think you touched on something really important, which is that no matter who we are and how high our tolerance for cannabis is, we all have endocannabinoid systems and receptors where cannabinoids bind. So some of these receptors are in our brains, and when THC binds to them, it creates a feeling of euphoria or being high. And this happens no matter how often you consume cannabis. This action will always happen.
So the biological action of THC binding to our receptors does not change, but then how come some people seem more impaired than others after using the same amount of cannabis? Like I can smoke a joint and be so high, and then another friend of mine can smoke it and be totally out of their mind.
Yep. So if we refer to the action of THC binding to the receptor as intoxication or the high, that happens for everyone. But going back to the topic of this episode, does that action always result in impairment or the ability to function normally? No. And that happens because of tolerance.
I was hoping you would say that. So what causes tolerance? And is it something that happens to frequent consumers of cannabis?
So, yes and no. There are biological, psychological, and environmental aspects to tolerance. So, biologically, some people just have weaker signaling as a result of cannabinoids binding to the receptors. So, if you think about signaling as like the volume on a stereo, some people's volume knob is naturally set to a lower volume than others. So, for people who are very sensitive to THC, that signal is ringing out loud and clear. Like they hear it in the moment that cannabinoid binds to that receptor, it is like a boom. But for some people, and so people who can use more THC before feeling the impairing effects, that volume is lower, and they are less sensitive to THC. Right. So now some people's sensitivity decreases over time. The more THC they use, the less it impacts them biologically. So it's like if you're in a room with loud music, you might feel very distracted by it at first, but the more time you spend in that room, you kind of adjust and you're affected by it less and less. So when you first walk in the room, like if you go to a club and the music's really loud, it may really hit you and you're like, I can't think about anything else. I can't talk to anyone else. Like this is just pervasive. But once you're in that club for like 30 minutes to an hour, that music may be the same volume, but it kind of fades into the background and you start to be able to focus on other things. So similarly with cannabis, even if that signal is pretty loud at first, the more THC binds to those receptors, the duller and less noticeable that signal becomes.
And I think we have another episode where we talked about like, is cannabis addictive or is marijuana addictive? And we talk about tolerance. And when you get to a point where you smoke all the time and you get to a point where you're not getting high anymore, I think your advice was to take a break.
Well, yeah, it is usually, but you brought up the point of medical cannabis patients earlier, and we're going to talk about them a little bit further into this episode. But if you're somebody who's like, I use cannabis multiple times a day to control muscle spasms, for example, you may have the goal of getting to the place where you're not being as affected in terms of intoxication or impairment with cannabis. So going back to the example of the club, if you're the bartender and you work in the club and you have to be there for multiple hours at a time, you don't want the loud music to impact you the way it does when you first step in. You want it to be able to fade into the background so you can focus on your job, so you cannot be distracted or annoyed by it. So similarly, if you are somebody that's using cannabis medicinally, you require it multiple times a day, your goal may be to be able to use it without feeling intoxicated and without getting impaired, because like we said, you have to go to work and take care of your kids and drive your car and do things that may be more difficult to do if you get that loud signal of intoxication every time you consume.
So biologically, some people are just wired with a higher sensitivity to THC, and others develop it over time. What about the psychological and environmental factors?
Well, one of the things we love to talk about on this show when it comes to cannabis is set and setting. So, how your mindset and how your environment play a role in how you experience cannabis. So, the first time someone gets high, the experience may feel overwhelming because it's a new mindset experienced in a new setting. But over time, your brain becomes accustomed to the feeling of the high of cannabis and experiencing it in more places. So, that being said, even experienced consumers can feel a little disjointed when consuming cannabis in a new place for the first time. I was recently teaching at the Ganjier program up in Humboldt, and we had a student remark that he smoked something he had brought from home. And when he smoked it at home, it didn't really affect him. I mean, he had kind of a similar effect and feeling as he always does, but smoking that same product in a completely different environment, he felt much higher because his setting had changed. So think about going on a roller coaster. The first time you ride it, your sensory experience is way more intense than after the 20th time you ride it, because over those times you get used to the mindset of being on a roller coaster, you get used to the setting that you're in. And so again, just like the loud music in the club, our brains like to adjust to our surroundings and bring that level back down.
Oh, I love these analogies that you're using, like roller coasters in the club, because I definitely feel higher when I use cannabis in new places for the first time, like a concert, for example. And it's like, the closer you are to the speakers, for example, and you can feel that intensity, and it kind of is like sometimes will be too much for me and overwhelming. And then other times, if I'm just kind of walking around and doing my thing, it doesn't bother me. So, how does this relate to impairment?
Okay, so we are talking about the difference between intoxication and impairment. So we've talked about intoxication, which is basically just the act of the cannabinoid like THC binding to the receptors, releasing that feeling of euphoria. And we talked about how level of intoxication is going to be related to one, just how naturally sensitive you are to that feeling, how often you experience that feeling, and whether you're in a mindset or a familiar setting when it's experiencing that feeling. But as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, we know people who may consume a lot of cannabis, but they never seem impaired, right? So they never seem like they are having trouble with their memory or putting words together or with their coordination. So while the intoxicating feelings of THC happen to someone sensitive to it or someone who has a mindset or an environment they're not used to when using cannabis, when that happens, you can also have impairment. So not just intoxication where you're actually feeling the effects of cannabis, but where that is actually resulting in some kind of side effect of impairment. So this could be lack of coordination. It could be affected mood and speech. Sometimes it's the distortion of time. I've definitely had that experience where I've had like a really strong edible and I'll be sure that like hours have gone by and it's only been like 5 minutes. So that distortion of time. Now, these effects are not dangerous unless the person is doing something like driving or another activity where impairment, not intoxication, but impairment might be harmful to themselves or others.
Okay, so I love that you also brought this up because I think it's important when we talk about impairment, right? Because there's a such thing as DWI. Um, so even though someone might not feel high, right, and might seem unimpaired, if something were to happen, like an accident, that's not your fault, let's say, and they do suspect or they do find cannabis in the car and they want to test you or do a blood test, you can still show a high amount of THC in your system. So it's good to be mindful of that and be careful. Some people need to use cannabis many times a day in order to manage their symptoms. So how does something like this impact medical patients?
Well, before we get to that, I want to go back to what you said about driving, because I think this is a really important point, and I want everyone at home to pay close attention to what I'm about to say. So, not all DUI laws measure impairment. Some of them only measure intoxication. So, Colorado is an example of this, where they have what we call per se driving laws around using cannabis. If you have 4 nanograms of THC in your blood, it doesn't matter. They do not have to prove that you were impaired. They can prove that you were intoxicated. So, like you said, let's say you get pulled over for speeding. You're driving fine, but let's say you're driving a little bit over the speed limit. You forget to use your turn signal. You have an expired inspection sticker. Like it could be a situation where you're not posing a huge risk to yourself or others, but you end up getting pulled over. It could be that you got rear-ended at a stoplight and you didn't do anything. You were just sitting there and someone rear-ended you. A lot of times they will choose to drug test and alcohol test everyone that's involved in the accident. If you have more than 4 nanograms of THC in your blood, then you are considered intoxicated, whether or not you are impaired. Now, some states rely on more impairment testing, where they're not necessarily testing the cannabis in your blood. They're giving you what we call field sobriety test. And a field sobriety test measures impairment, right? So they're testing to see whether you can walk a straight line, whether you can touch your fingertips to your nose, whether you can follow their light with your eyes. And this is more of a test of impairment rather than intoxication. In research, we argue that when you're talking about a DUI for cannabis, we should really be looking more at impairment than intoxication. And this gets to the question you just asked about medical cannabis patients. Medical cannabis patients likely always have more than 4 nanograms of THC in their system because they're using cannabis regularly. But because of the factors we just talked about, the dulling of the intoxication over time, they may not be impaired, even though they have a level of THC in their blood that designates them as intoxicated. And in fact, research on cannabis and driving shows that people that use cannabis very often have a better safety record of driving after using cannabis than people who use it occasionally. And this goes back to that intoxication versus impairment. If you're using it occasionally, your signaling is much stronger of THC in your brain. You're more likely using it in a place that it's unfamiliar to you, which can also lead to higher levels of intoxication and impairment. So it's really kind of backwards the way it is with alcohol, where the more alcohol that's in your system, the more impaired you are. We don't see that with cannabis. Now, when it comes to medical cannabis patients, we talked about this earlier. Like any medication, the goal is to experience the therapeutic effects without impairment. So, if you are using a medication that has side effects, you would like to be able to use that medication and not experience the side effects. If cannabis is your medication, that impairment, that difficulty with coordination, time distortion, difficulty with speech, those are all side effects to cannabis intoxication. So, building up a tolerance to THC is a way to reduce the likelihood of impairment for medical cannabis patients. Finding that minimum effective dose that we've talked about. These are both ways that medical cannabis patients can use cannabis frequently without concerns about impairment.
So, intoxication or getting high varies for different people based on natural biology, the development of tolerance, and the set and setting where cannabis is used. And based on these factors, a person may or may not feel impaired by cannabis. Is that the gist?
That's it. And that's why we recommend that people, especially those new to cannabis, start low and go slow until they know how cannabis affects them. Take care when using a new product or when using cannabis in a new setting. And if you find you are no longer experiencing the high and you want to experience the high, take a few days or a week off of using cannabis and your tolerance will reset.
And you won't find that on Google, but you will find it here. So thank you for tuning in. Remember that understanding the difference between intoxication and impairment is key to navigating the world of cannabis wisely. If you've got more burning questions or thoughts, you can always drop us a line, info@mypersonalplants.com. We're always eager to hear from you, and we love questions. So don't forget to explore our YouTube Garden of Wisdom, where you'll find more insightful content there. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, keep those questions coming.
Okay, sounds good. Bye.